Some of the most remarkable archaeological discoveries are not hidden inside famous ancient cities. They are scattered across mountains, deserts, forests, and remote landscapes. Ancient fortresses built from enormous stones, settlements buried beneath the sands of the Atacama, massive earthworks hidden beneath the Amazon rainforest, stone tombs standing among the mountains of Oman, and monuments in India, Japan, Peru, Spain, and Africa whose original purposes are still being investigated. In this documentary, we travel across Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, and the Middle East to explore some of the world's lesser-known archaeological sites, looking not at legends, but at the archaeological evidence left behind. Because sometimes, the most interesting part of an ancient site isn't what we know. It's what the evidence allows us to ask. From the first stone to the last settlement, these are 21 archaeological sites that reveal another side of the ancient world. Let's begin. The giant Bronze Age fortress of Motilla del Azuero. Across the dry plains of central Spain, a strange stone and earth fortress rises from the landscape. Its walls surround a maze of narrow passages, defensive towers, and a deep central structure that once protected something far more valuable than gold: water. This is Motilla del Azuero, one of the most remarkable Bronze Age fortified sites in the Iberian Peninsula. Motilla del Azuero was built more than 3,500 years ago. During the Bronze Age, when communities across central Spain were developing new forms of settlement, agriculture, and defense. The site stands in the La Mancha region, a landscape known today for its dry climate and limited water. For the people who lived here, controlling access to water could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The settlement was built around a fortified central area. Several concentric walls created layers of protection, with narrow entrances and carefully controlled passages. The deeper you moved into the fortress, the more restricted the space became. At the heart of the complex was something unusual. A deep well was constructed inside the fortified enclosure, allowing the inhabitants to reach groundwater beneath the settlement. This was not simply a convenient source of drinking water. It may have been one of the main reasons the fortress was built here. The well was surrounded by a complicated system of ramps and passages. People could move through the fortress, reach the water, and return without exposing the central resource to the open landscape. The entire arrangement suggests careful planning. The walls themselves were constructed from earth and stone, creating a massive defensive structure. Some sections were reinforced with timber, while towers and narrow corridors made direct access difficult. This was a fortress designed around both protection and control. Imagine approaching Motilla del Azuero thousands of years ago. Across the dry plain, you would see a compact fortified settlement rising above the landscape. The walls would make the entrance difficult to reach, and beyond them, the community's most valuable resource was protected at the center. But the fortress was not only a military installation. People lived here. Archaeologists have uncovered domestic areas, storage spaces, working areas, and evidence of everyday activity. The inhabitants farmed, kept animals, produced pottery, and worked with bronze. The settlement, therefore, gives us a glimpse of ordinary Bronze Age life, but under unusual conditions. Water scarcity shaped the way people organized their community. The architecture reflects that reality. The surrounding region was also changing during this period. Agriculture was becoming increasingly important, communities were growing, and control over resources could create new forms of social power. A fortified water source could therefore serve both practical and political purposes. One of the most fascinating features of Motilla del Azuero is its underground architecture. The central well reaches deep beneath the fortress, while the surrounding structures create a protected route toward it. The builders had to excavate, move enormous amounts of material, and maintain the stability of the walls. This required more than physical labor. It required knowledge of the landscape, an understanding of groundwater, and careful planning. The people who built Motilla del Azuero left no written explanation, but their architecture speaks clearly about the problems they were trying to solve. Eventually, the settlement was abandoned. The fortress walls remained, but the community that depended on them disappeared. The Bronze Age world of central Spain continued to change, and Motilla del Azuero gradually became part of the landscape. For centuries, the ruins remained largely forgotten. The earth covered parts of the structures, and the fortress slowly blended into the surrounding terrain. Modern archaeology eventually revealed its extraordinary design. Excavations uncovered the walls, the passages, the domestic areas, and most importantly, the ancient well at the heart of the complex. Together, they revealed a settlement designed around one of the most basic necessities of human life: water. Motilla del Azuero is remarkable because its enormous fortress was not built simply to protect wealth. At its center, the builders protected access to groundwater. In a dry landscape, that resource could be more valuable than almost anything else. More than 3,000 years later, the people who built the fortress are gone. Their society has disappeared, and their original reasons for building the complex can only be reconstructed from the ruins. But the walls remain, still surrounding the ancient well, a reminder of a Bronze Age community that turned water, stone, and earth into one of the most unusual fortresses of prehistoric Spain. The massive stone fortress of La Bastida, on a rugged hill in southeastern Spain, the remains of an enormous fortified settlement rise above the landscape. Massive stone walls, towers, narrow entrances, and buildings packed tightly across the hillside. More than 4,000 years ago, this was one of the most powerful settlements of Bronze Age Iberia. This is La Bastida, a remarkable fortress of the archaeological culture. La Bastida is located near Totana in Murcia, in a landscape of dry mountains and valleys. The settlement was established during the early Bronze Age and eventually became one of the largest and most heavily fortified communities in the region. What immediately stands out is the defensive architecture. The settlement was surrounded by enormous stone walls. Some sections were reinforced with towers, while carefully controlled entrances made access difficult. This was not an ordinary village. It was designed to protect itself. The builders chose the hill carefully. From the elevated position, the inhabitants could see across the surrounding valleys. Anyone approaching the settlement would have been visible from a considerable distance. The landscape itself became part of the defense. Inside the walls, archaeologists uncovered houses, storage areas, workspaces, and other structures connected with everyday life. People lived here permanently, produced tools, prepared food, and carried out specialized crafts. The settlement was also carefully organized. Buildings were arranged across different levels of the hillside, creating a dense urban environment. This organization suggests that La Bastida was not simply a defensive refuge. It was a center of political and economic power. The people who lived here belonged to the archaeological culture, a Bronze Age society that occupied parts of southeastern Iberia. Their communities were known for distinctive pottery, metalworking, burial traditions, and increasingly hierarchical settlements. Weapons and tools found at La Bastida provide evidence of advanced metalworking. Bronze objects, copper tools, and weapons were produced and used within this society. Metal was valuable, and access to it may have been closely connected with social status. The graves are particularly revealing. Many individuals were buried beneath houses, often accompanied by objects such as pottery, weapons, or ornaments. These burials provide evidence of differences in wealth and status. Some people were buried with far more valuable objects than others. That suggests La Bastida had a strongly unequal society. Power was not evenly distributed. Certain individuals or groups appear to have controlled greater resources, while others had much less. The enormous fortifications may therefore have protected more than the settlement itself. They may also have protected an established social order. Imagine approaching La Bastida 4,000 years ago. The hill would have been dominated by stone walls, watchtowers, and tightly packed buildings. Inside, people were working with metal, preparing food, trading goods, and living within a society that was becoming increasingly organized. The fortress also required enormous labor. Stones had to be quarried, transported up the hill, and carefully positioned. The walls needed to be maintained, and the settlement itself required constant organization. This raises an important question. Who had the authority to organize such a massive construction project? The archaeology suggests that La Bastida was governed by a powerful elite, but exactly how that political system worked remains uncertain. The settlement eventually became one of the most important centers of the archaeological world. Its influence extended beyond the immediate hill, connecting it with other communities throughout southeastern Iberia. But La Bastida did not survive forever. Around the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, the settlement was abandoned. The reasons remain debated. Environmental pressures, economic changes, and social instability may all have contributed. Without its inhabitants, the fortress slowly fell silent. Roofs collapsed, buildings deteriorated, and the hillside gradually became covered with earth. The society that built it disappeared, but the stone walls remained. Modern archaeological excavations have revealed the scale of the settlement. Researchers uncovered defensive walls, houses, burials, workshops, and thousands of objects. Together, they provide an unusually detailed picture of Bronze Age life in southeastern Spain. La Bastida is especially important because it challenges the idea that complex urban societies appeared only in the better-known civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia. Here, in southeastern Iberia, a powerful and highly organized society was building fortified settlements at roughly the same broad period. La Bastida is remarkable because its massive walls preserve the story of a Bronze Age society built around power, defense, and social hierarchy. People raised enormous fortifications on a mountain, created organized neighborhoods, worked with metal, and buried their dead beneath their homes. Then, the settlement was abandoned. Its people disappeared. Its political system collapsed, and the fortress became part of the landscape. But the walls still stand above Totana, a reminder that thousands of years ago, one of the most formidable societies of Bronze Age Iberia was already building cities designed to protect its power. The giant desert settlement of Tuller. Deep within the Atacama Desert of northern Chile, a cluster of ancient circular structures lies partially buried beneath the sand. Low walls curve across the ground. Doorways open into compact rooms, and entire sections of the settlement have been slowly swallowed by the desert. This is Tuller, one of the earliest known permanent settlements in the Atacama region. Tuller is located near San Pedro de Atacama in one of the driest environments on Earth. Today, the surrounding landscape appears almost completely barren. There is very little rainfall. Vegetation is sparse, and the ground is dominated by sand, salt, and volcanic terrain. Yet people once built a permanent settlement here. That immediately raises an important question. Why establish a village in such an unforgiving environment? The answer lies partly in the geography. Tuller was positioned near the ancient wetlands and water sources of the Atacama Basin. The nearby San Pedro River and associated wetlands provided access to water, while the surrounding landscape offered resources that could support agriculture, herding, and gathering. The desert was harsh, but it was not completely empty. The settlement developed during the first millennium BC and continued to be occupied for centuries. Archaeologists have identified numerous circular and semicircular structures, connected by narrow passageways and shared walls. Rather than forming a collection of isolated houses, the buildings created a compact settlement. Many of the walls were constructed from adobe and mud, materials that could be shaped using the soil available locally. The builders formed thick walls, created openings, and arranged rooms around courtyards and interconnected spaces. The architecture was simple in appearance, but highly adapted to the environment. The circular buildings are particularly distinctive. Some structures were relatively small, while others formed larger interconnected spaces. Their thick earthen walls would have provided protection from the intense heat of the desert during the day and helped retain warmth during colder nights. Tuller was not simply a temporary camp. Evidence from the settlement indicates repeated and sustained occupation. People lived here, prepared food, produced tools, stored materials, and maintained connections with other communities across the region. The archaeological remains also reveal a society adapted to several different ways of obtaining food. Agriculture was possible where water could be controlled, while animals could be raised in the surrounding landscape. People also exploited wild resources from the desert and nearby wetlands. The settlement, therefore, depended on a careful relationship with its environment. Trade was another important part of life in the Atacama. Communities were not isolated simply because they lived in a desert. Routes crossed the region, connecting settlements in the highlands, valleys, and coastal areas. Objects found at archaeological sites across northern Chile show that materials could travel considerable distances. Tuller existed within this wider network. The people living here were part of a landscape where movement and exchange connected communities separated by difficult terrain. The desert was an obstacle, but it was also a route. The architecture gives another clue about the organization of the settlement. Structures were built close together, creating protected spaces between them. Some walls appear to have been shared by multiple buildings. This suggests that construction was carried out according to a broader plan rather than entirely by individual households. Imagine walking through Tuller when the settlement was occupied. The desert would stretch beyond the buildings, but the village itself would have been active. People would have moved through narrow entrances, worked in the courtyards, prepared food, and maintained the mud walls. There would have been no modern roads, no electricity, and no permanent infrastructure connecting the village to distant cities. Everything required for life had to be obtained from the surrounding landscape or through exchange with other communities. Eventually, Tuller was abandoned. The exact reasons are not completely understood. Changes in water availability, environmental conditions, and shifts in regional settlement patterns may all have played a role. But the desert itself became one of the settlement's greatest forces. Once regular maintenance stopped, wind and sand began covering the structures. Slowly, the village disappeared beneath the desert. Rooms became buried, walls were eroded, and only fragments remained visible above the surface. In some ways, the desert helped preserve the settlement. The extremely dry climate limited the processes that normally destroy archaeological sites. Organic materials that would disappear rapidly in wetter environments could survive here for much longer. Modern archaeological research eventually revealed the true extent of Tuller. Excavations exposed rooms, walls, passageways, and evidence of everyday activity. What had appeared to be scattered ruins became recognizable as the remains of an organized settlement. But Tuller also tells us something broader about human adaptation. The Atacama is often described as one of the driest places on Earth. Yet people were living here thousands of years ago. They learned where water could be found, how to cultivate land, how to build with local materials, and how to survive within an environment that offered very little room for error. The settlement also shows that ancient desert communities were not necessarily isolated. Tuller belonged to a larger cultural landscape, connected through movement, trade, and shared traditions. People could cross the desert, exchange resources, and carry ideas between distant settlements. And then there is the architecture itself. The rounded adobe walls may appear modest compared with the stone monuments of other ancient civilizations, but their survival is significant. These were structures built from earth, in a landscape where wind and sand are constantly reshaping the ground. Their builders created a settlement capable of lasting for generations. Today, only part of Tuller remains exposed. The surrounding desert continues to move, gradually covering and uncovering different sections of the ancient village. The boundary between archaeology and landscape is constantly changing. The giant Buddha carved into the cliff, where 3 rivers meet in southwestern China. A colossal human figure sits directly against the mountainside. Its head rises above the surrounding trees, its shoulders stretch across the cliff, and its enormous feet rest beside the river below. This is the Leshan giant Buddha, one of the largest stone Buddha statues ever carved. The monument stands near Leshan in Sichuan province, at the meeting point of the Min, Dadu, and Qingyi rivers. For centuries, these waterways were important routes through the region, but they were also dangerous. Strong currents and sudden changes in water levels could create treacherous conditions for boats traveling through the gorge. The story of the Buddha begins with that problem. During the Tang dynasty, a Buddhist monk named Hai Tong became concerned about the dangers faced by boatmen on the rivers. According to historical accounts, he proposed creating a gigantic Buddha in the cliff above the water. The project was intended as a religious act, but also as a way of reducing the turbulence of the river. Construction began in the early 8th century. The scale of the project was enormous. Workers had to carve directly into the red sandstone cliff, removing huge quantities of rock from the mountain. There were no modern machines. Every section had to be shaped using the tools available to Tang-era craftsmen. The Buddha eventually reached a height of roughly 71 meters. Its head alone is around 15 meters high, while the ears extend more than 7 meters. A person standing beside the statue would appear tiny. The monument was designed to dominate the entire landscape. But the statue's size is only part of the story. The builders also had to solve a much more practical problem. How do you keep a monument this enormous from being damaged by rain? The answer was built directly into the sculpture. The Buddha contains an elaborate drainage system. Channels were carved into the body and around the head, allowing rainwater to flow away from vulnerable sections of the monument. Some drainage routes are hidden within the hair, behind the ears, and along the clothing. The sculpture itself became a piece of engineering. This is especially important because the surrounding climate can be extremely wet. Without proper drainage, water could penetrate the sandstone, accelerate erosion, and gradually damage the monument. The builders therefore had to think about weathering thousands of years before modern conservation science existed. The construction itself took decades. Haitong did not live to see the Buddha completed. After his death, other officials and patrons continued the project. The work eventually reached completion in the early 9th century. By then, the cliff had been transformed. A natural rock face had become a monumental religious figure, overlooking one of the busiest waterways in the region. The Buddha's expression is remarkably calm. The eyes face toward the river, while the hands rest naturally on the knees. The enormous figure was not designed to look aggressive. Instead, it presents an image of stability and protection above the dangerous waters. The surrounding cliffs contain additional Buddhist carvings, small statues, inscriptions, and religious images cover parts of the wider landscape. The giant Buddha was therefore not an isolated sculpture. It belonged to a much larger sacred environment. The location was also carefully chosen. The rivers converged directly beneath the statue, creating a dramatic relationship between the natural landscape and the monument. From the water, the Buddha would have appeared enormous. From the mountain, the rivers stretched away beneath it. The original idea of controlling the river is still debated. The enormous amount of rock removed during construction may have fallen into the water, potentially altering the riverbed and reducing some of the turbulence. But the exact extent of this effect remains uncertain. What is certain is the amount of labor involved. Thousands of workers, stone carvers, engineers, religious specialists, and administrators must have been involved over many years. The project required resources on a scale that only a powerful and organized society could support. The Tang dynasty was one of the most prosperous periods in Chinese history. Buddhism had become deeply established, and monumental religious projects were being created across the empire. Leshan reflects that wider cultural environment. But the Buddha also reveals something about ancient engineering. The craftsmen were not simply carving a giant figure. They were managing the stability of a cliff, controlling rainwater, working with sandstone, and designing a monument that had to survive the natural environment. Over the centuries, the statue experienced erosion, weathering, flooding, and human intervention. Parts of the surrounding landscape changed, and the monument required periods of repair and conservation. Yet the Buddha survived. Its enormous scale helped preserve its basic form, while the hidden drainage system protected vulnerable areas. The same engineering decisions made more than 1,000 years ago continue to influence the statue's survival today. Imagine seeing Leshan during the Tang dynasty. The Buddha would have towered above the river. Freshly carved sandstone would have formed the face, and the surrounding cliffs would have been filled with religious activity. Boats would have moved along the rivers below, passing beneath the gaze of the enormous figure. Today, the boats still pass through the same landscape. The rivers continue to meet below the cliff, and the Buddha still watches over the water. But the civilization that carved it has changed beyond recognition. The walls of Benin. Across the forests of southern Nigeria, a vast network of earthworks once surrounded the ancient city of Benin. Walls, deep ditches, raised banks, and enormous stretches of engineered earth once defined the landscape around one of West Africa's most powerful kingdoms. These were the walls of Benin, one of the largest earthwork systems ever constructed. The earthworks were built around the ancient kingdom of Benin, a powerful state that developed in what is now southern Nigeria. Rather than forming a single wall around one compact settlement, the system included networks of banks and ditches extending through the landscape. Some enclosed the royal city, while others surrounded villages, communities, and agricultural areas. The scale is difficult to appreciate from the ground. The original network extended for hundreds of kilometers, connecting different settlements across the forested landscape. Much of it was constructed from the earth that was excavated directly from the surrounding ground. The ditch provided the material, and the resulting embankment became the defensive barrier. This created an efficient system. Workers dug deep trenches, then placed the excavated soil along the edge, gradually creating high banks. The landscape itself became the building material. The earthworks were not all identical. Some sections were relatively modest, while others were enormous. Their size appears to have depended on the importance of the settlement and the terrain surrounding it. The system therefore developed over long periods, rather than being created as one single construction project. The walls also reveal something about the organization of Benin society. Building and maintaining such extensive earthworks required labor, planning, and authority. Large numbers of people would have been needed to excavate soil, transport it, shape the banks, and keep the structures maintained. The royal city was at the center of this political landscape. Benin City became an important administrative and ceremonial center, where the Oba, or king, ruled over the kingdom. The earthworks helped define the spaces controlled by that political system. But the walls were not necessarily built only for warfare. Their functions may have included controlling movement, defining territories, protecting settlements, and separating cultivated areas from surrounding forest. The ditches and banks formed boundaries within a much larger managed landscape. Imagine approaching Benin centuries ago. Dense forest would surround the settlement, and the earthworks would emerge from the vegetation. A deep ditch could block direct movement, while the raised bank created a clear boundary between one space and another. The forest environment also presented a major challenge. Vegetation grows rapidly in southern Nigeria, meaning earthworks could disappear beneath plants surprisingly quickly. Maintaining the structures would therefore have required continuous work. European visitors later described the impressive scale of Benin City, but much of the earlier earthwork landscape was difficult to understand from written accounts alone. Archaeology revealed that the city was connected to a much larger system of engineered earthworks. The construction also demonstrates sophisticated environmental knowledge. The builders understood how soil behaved, where drainage was necessary, and how to shape embankments so they could survive heavy seasonal rainfall. This was large-scale landscape engineering, using relatively simple materials. The earthworks also became connected with the growth of the Benin Kingdom. As political authority expanded, new settlements and boundaries were incorporated into the wider landscape. The walls therefore reflect not only defense, but the changing geography of power. By the late 19th century, Benin came into direct conflict with British imperial forces. In 1897, a British expedition attacked and occupied Benin City. The royal palace was looted, the city was heavily damaged, and the political system was profoundly disrupted. The earthworks survived in many places, but later development transformed large sections of the landscape. Roads, buildings, agriculture, and expanding modern settlements gradually destroyed or obscured parts of the ancient system. Today, only portions of the original earthworks remain clearly visible. Some survive as large banks and depressions. Others are hidden beneath modern development. Archaeologists continue to document what remains. What makes the walls of Benin especially important is their scale. They demonstrate that monumental architecture does not always require enormous stone blocks. Here, the builders used earth. They dug, moved, packed, and reshaped the landscape itself. The walls of Benin were therefore more than fortifications. They were part of a vast engineered landscape created by generations of people within one of West Africa's most powerful kingdoms. The original network stretched across an extraordinary distance, yet much of it has disappeared beneath the modern landscape. What remains is enough to reveal the scale of the achievement. The forests have changed, the city has expanded, and many ancient earthworks have been lost. But beneath roads, fields, and modern buildings, the outlines of the old landscape can still be found. The walls of Benin remind us that some of Africa's greatest monuments were not built from stone at all. They were built from earth, labor, organization, and generations of human effort. The Cyclopean Ridge of the Mediterranean. Across the island of Minorca, a broad limestone ridge rises above the surrounding landscape. On its summit, massive stone structures spread across the hillside. Circular houses, enormous walls, raised platforms, and mysterious towers built from blocks weighing hundreds of kilograms. This is Torre don Galmés, one of the largest prehistoric settlements on the island. The settlement occupies a naturally elevated position in southern Minorca, with wide views across the surrounding countryside. From here, the inhabitants could observe much of the landscape around them. But the importance of Torre don Galmés was not simply its position. The site developed into a substantial community and remained occupied for centuries. The earliest occupation dates back to the Bronze Age, but the settlement expanded significantly during the later Talaitic period. This was the period when communities across the Balearic Islands constructed enormous stone monuments, often using massive blocks without mortar. At Torre don Galmés, that tradition produced an unusually complex settlement. One of its most striking features is the teleots. These monumental stone structures rise above the settlement, built from enormous blocks carefully stacked into thick walls. Their exact functions remain debated. They may have served defensive, watch, social, or ceremonial purposes. The evidence does not provide one simple answer. The settlement also contains numerous circular houses. Their thick stone walls created compact living spaces, with internal rooms arranged around central areas. Some houses contain hearths, storage spaces, and features associated with everyday domestic activity. This tells us something important. Torre don Galmés was not simply a monument. People actually lived here. The scale of the settlement suggests that it supported a substantial population. Families lived within the stone houses. Food was prepared, tools were produced, and agricultural resources were processed. The surrounding landscape provided much of what the community needed. Water was especially important. The inhabitants constructed systems for collecting and managing water, including underground or partially protected installations. In the dry Mediterranean climate, reliable access to water would have been essential for maintaining a large settlement. The settlement's position also offered access to fertile agricultural land. People cultivated crops, raised animals, and exploited resources from the surrounding island. The stone architecture therefore existed within a much larger agricultural landscape. But Torre don Galmés was not isolated. Menorca sits in the western Mediterranean, a region connected by maritime routes for thousands of years. Objects discovered at the settlement indicate contact with wider Mediterranean networks. Later occupation brought new influences. During the Punic and Roman periods, the island became increasingly connected to larger Mediterranean political and economic systems. Torre don Galmés continued to be used, but its role changed over time. This long sequence of occupation is one of the site's most important features. The settlement was not created, used, and abandoned within a single generation. Different communities returned to the same location, modified older structures, and added new ones. That makes the ruins difficult to interpret. A wall may belong to one period, while the structure beside it may have been altered centuries later. The site is therefore a layered record of changing societies. Imagine approaching Torre don Galmés during its prehistoric occupation. The hillside would not have looked like an empty archaeological site. Smoke would have risen from hearths. People would have moved between the houses. Animals would have been kept nearby, and the massive stone towers would have dominated the settlement. The builders worked without modern machinery. Large limestone blocks had to be quarried, moved, and positioned by organized labor. The architecture is impressive, not because the technology was mysterious, but because the construction demanded coordination and knowledge of stone. The exact social system behind that work remains uncertain. Were these monuments controlled by local elites? Were they communal projects? Did different families build different structures? Archaeology provides clues, but the political organization of Talaiotic Menorca remains only partly understood. Another question concerns the purpose of the monumental towers. Their elevated position makes defensive observation possible, but some evidence points toward other functions. They may have been places where communities gathered, symbols of authority, or structures connected with rituals. It is possible that their meaning changed over time. Eventually, the settlement lost its importance. Roman influence transformed the island, and later centuries brought further political and cultural changes. The ancient community that built the great stone structures disappeared, but the settlement itself remained on the ridge. Today, Torre don Galmés preserves one of the clearest examples of prehistoric urban organization in Menorca. Its houses, towers, water systems, and stone walls reveal a community that adapted carefully to the island's environment. The site is remarkable because of its combination of scale and longevity. For generations, people returned to the same ridge. They built new structures, reused old ones, managed water, produced food, and maintained a community surrounded by massive stone architecture. Torre don Galmés is therefore more than a collection of prehistoric ruins. It is the remains of a living settlement, a place where architecture, agriculture, water management, and social organization developed together across centuries. The people who built the great stone towers left no written explanation of their world, their language, their political system, and many of their beliefs remain difficult to reconstruct. But the ridge survives, and across the limestone landscape of Menorca, those enormous stones still preserve the outline of a community that once looked out across the Mediterranean. Masuda no Iwafune, the stone ship of Japan. On a quiet hill in Nara Prefecture, a massive stone formation rests above the surrounding landscape. At first glance, it looks almost like a giant vessel carved from the mountain. Its surface is roughly shaped, its sides are steep, and on top are two unusual rectangular depressions. This is Masuda no Iwafune, the stone ship of Masuda, one of Japan's most enigmatic ancient stone monuments. Masuda no Iwafune stands on the hillside near Kashihara in Nara Prefecture, an area surrounded by some of Japan's most important archaeological landscapes. The region was once at the center of early Japanese political and religious development. Ancient tombs, burial mounds, stone monuments, and ceremonial sites are scattered across the surrounding countryside. But Masuda no Iwafune is different. It does not clearly resemble a tomb, a building, or an ordinary piece of architecture. The monument is formed from a single enormous block of granite. It measures roughly several meters across, and its upper surface contains two large rectangular openings. Around the edges, the stone appears to have been deliberately shaped. Straightened surfaces and angular cuts suggest that people modified the natural rock, but the original purpose remains uncertain. The name Masuda no Iwafune means something like Masuda's stone ship. The comparison comes from its unusual shape. The monument appears to have a pointed or raised end, giving it the appearance of a vessel resting on the hillside. But there is no evidence that it was ever intended to function as an actual ship. The name reflects how later observers interpreted its form. One of the most interesting details is its position. The stone rests on a natural slope, but its base contains evidence that the rock was deliberately worked. Some researchers have suggested that the builders may have attempted to level or reshape the surface, perhaps preparing the monument for a purpose that is now impossible to reconstruct. The two rectangular depressions on the top are particularly difficult to explain. They are positioned close together and appear to have been deliberately carved. But what they were meant to hold, or how they were used, remains unknown. Several theories have been proposed. The monument has been interpreted as a possible ritual object, a platform, a marker, or something connected with ancient astronomical or religious practices. Other explanations have suggested that it may have been an unfinished structure, but none of these interpretations has been conclusively demonstrated. This uncertainty is partly caused by the lack of archaeological material immediately explaining the monument. There is no surviving inscription identifying its creator, no clear burial chamber, and no written account describing why the enormous stone was shaped. The stone itself is almost all that remains. Imagine the people who first worked this granite. They had to remove material from an enormous natural block, shape its upper surface, and create the rectangular depressions without modern machinery. Even though the monument is unfinished or difficult to interpret, the amount of labor involved would still have been considerable. The surrounding region provides an important context. Nara was one of the major centers of early Japanese civilization. During the Asuka period, political power was becoming increasingly centralized. Buddhism was spreading, and monumental construction was transforming the landscape. Stone monuments from this period sometimes have meanings that are difficult to reconstruct from archaeology alone. Masuda no Iwafune is generally associated with this broader historical landscape, but its precise date remains uncertain. That makes interpretation even more difficult. If the monument belongs to the same general period as nearby stone structures, it may have been connected with the religious or political world developing around it. But that connection cannot be proven simply from its appearance. The granite itself also creates problems. It is extremely hard. Cutting and shaping such a massive block would have required persistent work, likely using stone and metal tools capable of gradually removing the surface. The builders were not carving a soft material. They were modifying one of the hardest natural materials available to them. There is another possibility. Perhaps the monument was never completed. The unfinished appearance of parts of the stone has led some researchers to suggest that construction may have stopped before the intended design was finished. If so, the most important evidence may be the work that was never completed. Why would a project involving such enormous labor suddenly stop? Political changes, the death of an important patron, a change in religious practice, or simply a shift in the intended use of the site could have brought construction to an end. But there is no definitive evidence identifying the reason. The monument also belongs to a wider tradition of unusual stone structures in the Nara region. Other ancient stone monuments have been found nearby, some associated with elite burials, others with uncertain ritual purposes. Together, they show that ancient communities in the region were experimenting with stone architecture in ways that are not always easy to classify. Over the centuries, Masuda no Iwafuni remained exposed on the hillside. Weather gradually softened its surfaces. Vegetation grew around it, and its original surroundings changed. Whatever ceremonies or activities once took place here disappeared from living memory. Today, the stone remains in almost complete silence. There are no walls surrounding it, no surviving buildings explaining it, and no inscription telling us exactly what it was meant to be. Only the enormous granite form remains. And that is what makes Masuda no Iwafuni so fascinating. It is an archaeological object where the physical evidence is obvious, but the meaning is not. We can see that people modified the stone. We can see the unusual depressions. We can see the enormous amount of labor involved. But we cannot confidently say what they intended. Perhaps it was connected with ritual. Perhaps it was part of a larger monument that was never completed. Or perhaps its original function was something that has no modern equivalent. The evidence does not allow us to choose one explanation with certainty. Masuda no Iwafuni remains on its hillside in Nara, a huge granite monument shaped by human hands, but never fully explained. The people who worked the stone are long gone. The world that gave the monument meaning has disappeared, and after more than 1,000 years, the strange stone still looks almost like a vessel waiting to leave the mountain, although no one can say exactly where its builders intended it to go. The stone labyrinth of Kadaki. Across the grasslands of Maharashtra, a remarkable pattern of stones lies almost level with the ground. From a distance, it can be easy to miss, but viewed from above, the arrangement becomes unmistakable. 15 concentric stone circuits, curving inward toward a tightly coiled center. This is the Kadaki stone labyrinth, a recently documented megalithic monument in the Deccan region of India. The labyrinth is located near Kadaki village in Dharashiv district of Maharashtra, within a semi-arid grassland landscape on the Deccan Plateau. It was identified during investigations in the area, and its unusual design immediately attracted archaeological attention. The structure measures roughly 15 meters across, but its significance comes less from its size than from its unusual arrangement. Unlike a conventional maze, the Kadaki structure does not contain a network of branching passages. Instead, a single continuous pathway winds between the stone circuits, gradually leading toward the center. This is the basic characteristic of a classical labyrinth. The builders created the pattern using locally available Deccan basalt, a dark volcanic stone that dominates the geology of the region. The stones themselves are relatively modest compared with the enormous blocks found at some megalithic monuments. Many are naturally fractured pieces of basalt, collected from nearby outcrops, then arranged into low, dry stone walls. The stones were placed without mortar, creating a pattern that could survive for centuries while remaining close to the natural surface. The number of circuits is what makes Kadaki especially unusual. 15 concentric rings create a much more complicated design than most previously documented stone labyrinths in India. Earlier examples generally contain fewer circuits, making the Kadaki monument an important addition to the archaeological record of Indian labyrinths. But the structure raises an immediate question. Why build a labyrinth here? The answer is not known. Researchers have proposed several possibilities, including ritual activity, astronomical observation, commemorative functions, and possible connections with ancient movement and trade routes. None of these interpretations can yet be treated as proven. The landscape around the monument provides another important clue. Kadaki lies within a region that was connected to ancient routes crossing the Deccan. Other stone labyrinths documented in Maharashtra have also been found near historic paths associated with trade and pilgrimage. Some researchers have therefore suggested that labyrinths may have had a relationship with travelers moving between important settlements and commercial centers. The Kadaki example is particularly interesting because of its broader historical setting. The monument has been provisionally associated with the Iron Age to early historic period, with researchers suggesting an approximate age of around 2,000 years. That chronology remains a preliminary interpretation rather than a precise construction date. The structure itself does not carry an inscription telling us when it was built. Archaeological material from the wider area provides additional context. Researchers have pointed to evidence including Roman period coins, terracotta lamps, semi-precious stone beads, and iron objects, all of which indicate that the surrounding Deccan landscape participated in wider networks of movement and exchange during the early historic period. This is where the labyrinth becomes more interesting. It was not necessarily constructed in an isolated landscape. The Deccan was crossed by routes connecting inland settlements with important commercial centers and ports. Goods moved, people traveled, and ideas could travel with them. Whether the labyrinth itself was connected to those networks remains uncertain, but its location deserves attention. There is also the question of construction. The builders had to establish 15 regular circuits, maintain consistent spacing, and create a continuous route toward the center. Even a relatively small labyrinth requires planning. A central point would have been necessary, along with some method of measuring the different circular paths. The basalt was locally available, so the builders did not need to transport the material across great distances. That simplified the construction process. But the stones still had to be collected, moved, arranged, and fitted together. The monument therefore represents organized labor on a modest but carefully controlled scale. Imagine the landscape when the labyrinth was first constructed. The surrounding grasslands would have looked different, but the dark basalt stones would have formed a sharply defined pattern against the earth. People could walk along the winding pathway, moving gradually from the outer circuit toward the center. What happened there? We simply do not know. Perhaps the movement itself was important. A labyrinth forces a person to follow a predetermined route, repeatedly changing direction, while remaining within the same overall pattern. If the structure had a ritual function, that journey may have carried symbolic meaning. But there is no surviving text explaining what the builders believed. An astronomical interpretation has also been proposed. The geometry of the monument makes it possible to examine its orientation, its center, and its relationship with the surrounding horizon. Researchers are investigating whether particular alignments could have been intentional, but such possibilities require further evidence before they can be treated as established facts. The monument's survival is itself interesting. It was constructed without deep foundations, yet much of the circular arrangement remains recognizable. The surrounding grassland helped protect the site from extensive modern disturbance. Even so, the low stone walls remain vulnerable to erosion, agricultural activity, vegetation, and accidental damage. Kadaki is also important because it changes our understanding of labyrinth traditions in India. For a long time, only a limited number of ancient stone labyrinths were known from the subcontinent. The discovery and documentation of additional examples in Maharashtra and elsewhere has revealed that these structures were not isolated curiosities. They formed part of a broader archaeological phenomenon. Yet the meaning of that tradition remains difficult to reconstruct. Were these places ceremonial? Were they connected with travel? Did they commemorate the dead? Could they have been used for astronomical observation? Or did different labyrinths serve different purposes? The evidence does not yet provide a single answer. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes Kadaki significant. The monument is simple enough to understand physically, but difficult to understand culturally. We can trace the stones, measure the circuits, study the basalt, and examine the surrounding landscape. But we cannot yet recover the meaning that the builders attached to the path. The broken giant of Loch Marriaker. Along the southern coast of Brittany, a massive stone monument lies across an ancient landscape shaped by thousands of years of human activity. Nearby stand enormous stone chambers, burial monuments, and rows of prehistoric stones. But among them was once something far more extraordinary. A single standing stone of enormous size, known today as the Grand Menhir Brisé de Loch Marriaker. The Grand Menhir once stood more than 20 meters high, making it one of the largest known prehistoric standing stones ever erected in Europe. Today, it lies broken into several enormous pieces, but even in its fallen state, the scale of the monument is difficult to ignore. The stone was carved from local granite, then transported and raised during the Neolithic period, more than 6,000 years ago. This was a time when farming communities were spreading across Western Europe, building permanent settlements, constructing burial monuments, and transforming entire landscapes with stone. The monument was not standing alone. Loch Marriaker contains a remarkable concentration of prehistoric structures, including dolmens, burial chambers, stone alignments, and other megalithic monuments. Together, they reveal that this coastline was repeatedly used for ceremonial and funerary activity. But the Grand Menhir is different. It was not a burial chamber. It was a single, enormous block, deliberately shaped and transported, then raised vertically in the landscape. The effort required would have been extraordinary. The stone is estimated to have weighed around 280 tons. Moving such a block would have required careful coordination. The builders had no wheeled cranes, no engines, and no modern lifting equipment. They had timber, stone tools, ropes, levers, and above all, organized human labor. But transporting the stone was only the beginning. The builders then had to raise it. A monument more than 20 meters tall could easily collapse during construction. The ground had to be prepared, the stone positioned, and the structure gradually brought upright. The exact techniques remain uncertain. Archaeologists have proposed combinations of ramps, levers, ropes, and earthen embankments. The evidence does not preserve a complete construction method, but the finished monument demonstrates that the builders had solved the problem somehow. Imagine the Grand Menhir when it was still standing. A huge granite pillar would have risen above the surrounding landscape, visible from considerable distances. People approaching Loch Marricker would have encountered the monument long before reaching the other ceremonial structures. Its position becomes even more interesting when the surrounding monuments are considered together. The Grand Menhir stood close to major Neolithic burial monuments, including the Table de Marchands and the Urgra tumulus. These were not isolated structures. They formed part of a carefully used monumental landscape. The builders were therefore doing more than simply placing a large stone in the ground. They were organizing space, creating relationships between monuments, and establishing permanent features within the landscape. Exactly what those relationships meant remains uncertain. The Grand Menhir eventually fell. It broke into several large sections, and the original reason for its collapse is still debated. Some possibilities include natural failure, structural instability, or deliberate human action. There is no simple surviving record explaining what happened. Its broken condition has created another mystery. The stone appears to have been intentionally shaped before it was raised. Its surfaces were worked, its form was controlled, and its enormous size suggests that considerable effort went into preparing it. Why invest so much labor in a monument that would eventually be abandoned? The answer may lie in the wider Neolithic landscape. The communities of Western France were constructing monuments that could outlive individual generations. Burial chambers, mounds, standing stones, and ceremonial spaces became permanent landmarks. They connected communities with particular places, and perhaps with their ancestors. Loch Marricker appears to have remained important for a long period. Different monuments were constructed, modified, and eventually abandoned. The landscape itself became a record of changing practices. The people who built these monuments left no written explanations. There are no inscriptions telling us who ordered the Grand Menhir to be raised, or what ceremonies took place around it. Archaeologists must reconstruct its significance from the monument itself, and from the surrounding structures. The stone also reveals the extraordinary organizational ability of Neolithic communities. A society capable of moving a 280-ton block, transporting it across the landscape, and raising it vertically, had to possess systems of cooperation far beyond the individual household. Perhaps hundreds of people were involved. Perhaps the work was carried out in stages over a long period. The exact organization is unknown, but the monument itself is evidence of collective effort on an enormous scale. Eventually, the great stone fell. Its pieces remained across the landscape, while later generations built other monuments nearby. The world that had created the Grand Menhir disappeared, but the stone survived. Today, the broken blocks still lie at Loch Marricker. They may no longer dominate the horizon as they once did, but their size reveals what the ancient monument must have looked like when it stood upright. The giant stone tomb of Lilolgi. Across the rugged landscape of northern Sardinia, a long stone monument rises from the hills. Massive slabs form its central structure. A curved arrangement of stones stands at the front, and behind it lies a burial chamber built thousands of years ago. This is the giant's tomb of Lilolgi, one of the most impressive funerary monuments of the Nuragic civilization. Lilolgi is located in the Gallura region of Sardinia, an area known for granite hills, rocky outcrops, and scattered prehistoric monuments. The tomb belongs to the long tradition of megalithic burial architecture that developed across Sardinia during the Bronze Age. These monuments were not isolated graves. They were carefully constructed places where communities interacted with their dead. The name Giant's Tomb comes from the traditional appearance of these monuments. The enormous curved stone arrangement at the front can resemble the horns or shoulders of a giant, while the long burial chamber extends behind it. But archaeologists do not interpret these structures as tombs for mythical giants. They were collective funerary monuments built for human communities. The central burial chamber is constructed from large stone slabs, creating a long, narrow space beneath the monument. The entrance opens toward the semicircular forecourt, a distinctive feature of many Sardinian giants' tombs. This arrangement created a space between the burial chamber and the surrounding landscape. The curved forecourt is particularly striking. Large upright stones form a broad semicircle, almost like an open enclosure facing the entrance. This area may have provided space for gatherings, ceremonies, or commemorative activities connected with the dead. Exactly what happened here remains uncertain. The monument was built during the Bronze Age, at a time when Sardinian communities were developing increasingly complex settlements and monumental traditions. Across the island, people were constructing nuraghi, building fortified settlements, working with bronze, and creating elaborate burial monuments. Lilolgi belongs to that wider cultural landscape. The construction required considerable effort. Large granite blocks had to be selected, extracted, transported, and positioned. Some of the stones are enormous, yet the builders arranged them into a carefully recognizable architectural form. The monument therefore represents more than individual burial. A structure of this scale required cooperation. People had to organize labor, gather materials, prepare the ground, and maintain the monument after construction. The tomb became a permanent feature of the landscape. Imagine approaching Lilolgi when it was still actively used. The surrounding hills would have been familiar territory, but the enormous stone monument would have stood apart from the natural landscape. People could gather in front of the tomb, while the burial chamber remained behind the great stone facade. The relationship between the living and the dead appears to have been important. The tomb was not hidden underground. Its entrance and forecourt were visible, creating a permanent place where later generations could return. The monument could therefore serve as both a burial site and a place of remembrance. Archaeological investigations have revealed evidence of burials and material associated with the monument. Objects placed with the dead can provide clues about the people who used the tomb, their possessions, and the practices surrounding burial. But the full meaning of the ceremonies remains beyond our reach. This is one of the difficulties of studying prehistoric Sardinia. The nuragic communities left behind thousands of structures, but they did not leave written records explaining their beliefs. Archaeologists must reconstruct the past from architecture, burials, artifacts, and the relationships between different sites. Lilolgi becomes even more interesting when considered alongside the other monuments of Gallura. The surrounding landscape contains nuraghi, sacred wells, settlement remains, and other megalithic tombs. These sites show that prehistoric Sardinia was not a collection of isolated communities. It was a landscape filled with connected places. The tomb may also have been used over an extended period. Like many prehistoric monuments, its meaning could have changed as generations returned to it. New burials may have been added, existing structures may have been modified, and later communities may have interpreted the monument differently from its original builders. Eventually, the tomb ceased to serve its original purpose. The ceremonies ended. The community that maintained it disappeared, and the monument became part of the surrounding landscape. But unlike temporary buildings, its massive stones remained. Thousands of years of weathering have changed the surfaces. Vegetation has grown around the stones, and sections of the original structure have deteriorated, yet the basic form of the monument is still recognizable. Today, Lilolgi provides a rare glimpse into how prehistoric Sardinian communities treated their dead. It shows that burial could involve enormous public monuments, not simply individual graves. The dead were given a permanent place within the landscape, and the living were given a place to return. The most remarkable aspect of the monument may therefore be its simplicity. There are no towering temples, no written inscriptions, no elaborate statues, only stone, carefully arranged by people who lived thousands of years ago. The giant's tomb of Lilolgi is remarkable because its enormous stones preserve a tradition that survived across generations. a burial chamber, a monumental forecourt, and carefully positioned granite slabs transformed a section of the Sardinian landscape into a place connected with the dead. The people who built the tomb left no explanation of what they believe, or what ceremonies took place beneath its stones. But the monument survived, and today, standing among the hills of northern Sardinia, Lilolgi still marks the place where an ancient community chose to remember its dead, not with a written record, but with stone. The ancient stelae of Tutofela. In the highlands of southern Ethiopia, rows of ancient stone monuments rise from the landscape. Some are tall and carefully shaped. Others are simpler slabs standing among the fields. They belong to a remarkable tradition of monumental stone construction that continued for generations. This is Tutofela, one of the important megalithic landscapes of Ethiopia. Tutofela lies in the Gidio region of southern Ethiopia, an area known for its fertile highlands, dense vegetation, and distinctive cultural landscapes. The stone monuments here are associated with ancient communities who transformed parts of the landscape with carefully positioned stelae. The most striking feature is the concentration of standing stones. Some are plain, while others were shaped and decorated. Their surfaces can carry carved details, including geometric patterns and representations that may have held symbolic meaning. But the stones were not simply placed randomly. They formed part of a wider funerary and commemorative tradition. Archaeological investigations in the region have identified relationships between the stelae and burials, suggesting that these monuments were closely connected with the treatment and remembrance of the dead. This becomes especially interesting because the monuments were created in a landscape that was already being used for agriculture and settlement. The stelae stood among places where people lived and worked, creating a visible connection between everyday life and ancestral memory. Some of the stones are surprisingly tall. Moving a large stone through the Ethiopian highlands would have required organized labor, even before the monument was finally positioned. The builders had to select suitable stone, shape it when necessary, transport it, and raise it vertically. The exact methods remain uncertain. There are no surviving construction records describing how the stones were moved. But their presence provides clear evidence that these communities were capable of coordinating substantial collective work. The monuments also appear to have been created over long periods, rather than representing one single construction event. The landscape records generations of activity. New stones could be added, older monuments could remain visible, and the cemetery could gradually expand. Imagine approaching Tutofela centuries ago. The landscape would have been filled with vegetation, cultivated fields, and settlements. Among them, tall stone monuments would have marked particular locations. They would have been impossible to overlook. Their visibility may have been important. A standing stone can become a permanent marker, identifying a burial place, a community, or an important ancestor. The monument remains even after the person and the people who knew them are gone. Some of the stones contain human or symbolic imagery. These carvings are particularly valuable because they provide clues about how the builders represented identity and status. But the meanings of many of these designs remain uncertain. This is one of the challenges of studying prehistoric Ethiopia. The communities who created the monuments left little written evidence explaining their beliefs. Archaeologists, therefore, have to work from the physical remains, burials, stone forms, carvings, and the arrangement of monuments across the landscape. The wider Gidio region contains many other cultural landscapes, stone monuments, burial places, traditional settlements, and agricultural systems developed alongside one another. Tutofela should therefore be understood as part of a much larger environment, rather than as an isolated archaeological site. The relationship between the stones and the dead is particularly important. Some monuments are associated with graves beneath or around them, suggesting that the stones could have acted as permanent markers for individuals or groups. But not every aspect of the funerary tradition is understood. Why were certain people commemorated with larger monuments? Why were some stones decorated while others remained plain? And what ceremonies accompanied their construction? These are questions that archaeology can approach, but cannot yet answer completely. Over time, the original communities changed. Burial practices changed. Settlements shifted. And the meanings attached to the monuments may have been transformed. Yet the stones remained standing. Their survival is partly due to their simplicity. Unlike wooden structures, they could remain visible for centuries with relatively little maintenance. Weather gradually softened their surfaces. but the monuments themselves continued to mark the landscape. Modern archaeological research has helped bring these sites into wider attention. The stelae provide evidence for complex social traditions that developed in the Ethiopian highlands, outside the better-known centers of ancient northeastern Africa. They also challenge the idea that monumental architecture always requires enormous buildings. Here, the monument may be a single stone. Its importance comes from its position, its association with the dead, and the labor required to place it there. Tutofela is remarkable because the landscape preserves a conversation between the living and the dead that lasted for generations. People shaped stones, raised them above the ground, and placed them among the landscapes where their communities continued to live. The people who created the monuments eventually disappeared, their traditions changed, and much of their original meaning was lost. But the stelae remained. Across the highlands of southern Ethiopia, they still stand among the landscape, quiet markers of people whose names are forgotten, but whose presence was made permanent in stone. The puzzle stones of Silistani. On a rocky peninsula overlooking Lake Umayo, a collection of enormous stone towers rises from the highland landscape. Their walls curve gently upward. Their stones fit together with remarkable precision. And in some places, the joints are so carefully made that the masonry appears almost seamless. This is Silistani, one of the most important funerary landscapes of the Lake Titicaca region. The site lies near Puno, Peru, high on the Altiplano, where the air is thin and the surrounding landscape is dominated by mountains, open grasslands, and the waters of Lake Umayo. The most distinctive structures are the cholpas, tall funerary towers built for the dead. Some rise several meters above the ground, while the largest reach around 12 meters in height. The towers were constructed in different styles. Some were built from roughly shaped stones. Others used adobe. But the most elaborate examples were constructed from carefully cut stone blocks. These are the structures that give Silistani its extraordinary appearance. The blocks were shaped individually, then fitted together without conventional mortar. The masonry is especially precise. The stones were cut to follow the curvature of the tower, while the walls gradually narrow and change shape as they rise. The result is not a simple stack of rectangular blocks. Each piece had to correspond to the geometry of the structure around it. This raises an obvious question. How were such heavy stones shaped and positioned at this altitude? The builders had no cranes, no modern lifting equipment, and no mechanical cutting tools. Yet the surviving towers show that they were capable of moving, shaping, and assembling substantial stone elements with considerable precision. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Silistani funerary tradition developed over several periods. The landscape contains structures associated with Kala traditions, along with later forms influenced by the Inca Empire. This means the towers were not all constructed at the same moment. Different communities and political periods left their mark on the peninsula. The purpose of the cholpas was funerary. The dead were placed inside the chambers, often in a flexed or fetal position, along with belongings and offerings. The towers therefore served as permanent monuments to important individuals and groups. Their entrances are generally positioned toward the east, facing the direction of the rising sun. This orientation may have carried religious significance, although the exact beliefs surrounding the practice remain difficult to reconstruct. The archaeological evidence shows the pattern clearly, but the meaning behind it is less certain. One of the most famous structures is the Cholpa del Lagarto, named after a lizard carved into one of its stone blocks. The tower rises roughly 12 meters, making it one of the most prominent monuments on the peninsula. The carved animal adds another layer to the architecture, but its precise symbolic meaning remains uncertain. The stonework becomes even more interesting when examined closely. Some blocks have smooth, carefully finished surfaces, while their edges were shaped to fit precisely against neighboring stones. There is little need for visible mortar. The weight of the stones, combined with their carefully prepared surfaces, created a remarkably stable structure. The builders also had to deal with the unusual shape of the towers. Many cholpas are not simple cylinders. Their walls curve, their diameter changes, and the upper sections require increasingly careful placement of stone. A block suitable for one level could not simply be exchanged with a block from another. The geometry had to be controlled throughout the construction. This is why the masonry can appear almost like a puzzle. Every stone occupies a particular position, and the surrounding blocks depend on it. The monument was effectively assembled piece by piece, with the overall form determined long before the final stone was placed. but the construction process itself remains partly hidden. Researchers have proposed the use of ramps and other simple mechanical methods to raise heavy blocks. Evidence from unfinished structures and construction remains has helped archaeologists investigate how the builders may have moved stone upward. Yet there is no surviving construction manual describing the entire process. Imagine the peninsula during the period when these towers were being built. The landscape would already have been important to local communities, but the skyline would gradually have changed as new funerary towers appeared. One generation added a monument, then another, until the rocky peninsula became filled with stone structures. Silistani was therefore more than a cemetery. The archaeological landscape also contains ceremonial features, terraces, monoliths, and other structures connected with activity around the funerary monuments. The peninsula became a place where the living interacted with the memory of the dead. The location itself is striking. The towers stand against the open sky, with Lake Umayo surrounding much of the peninsula. The landscape gives the monuments a powerful sense of isolation, but their position may also have helped make them visible, turning the tombs into permanent markers within the surrounding territory. Eventually, the political world of the region changed. The Kala communities were incorporated into the expanding Inca Empire, and new architectural influences appeared. Some of the most finely worked chalpas at Silistani reflect this later period. The older funerary tradition was not simply erased. It was modified and incorporated into a changing political landscape. After the Spanish conquest, the societies that had maintained these traditions were transformed. The ceremonies ended. The tombs were no longer constructed in the same way, and many of the monuments gradually deteriorated, but the stone towers remained. The carved caves of the Barabar Hills. In the rocky hills of Bihar, a series of ancient chambers has been cut directly into solid granite. The entrances are simple, the interiors are almost perfectly shaped, and the walls are polished so smoothly that even after more than 2,000 years, they can still reflect light. These are the Barabar Caves, the oldest surviving rock-cut caves in India. The caves are located in the Barabar Hills, northeast of present-day Gaya. They were created during the Mauryan period, around the 3rd century BC, at a time when the Indian subcontinent was experiencing major political and religious changes. The most important ruler associated with the caves is Ashoka, the Mauryan emperor whose reign covered a vast part of the subcontinent. Several caves contain inscriptions identifying their association with religious communities. The earliest inscriptions show that some of the caves were dedicated to the Ajivikas, an ascetic religious movement that existed alongside Buddhism and Jainism. This makes the caves important not only for their architecture, but also for understanding religious life in ancient India. What immediately stands out is the workmanship. The builders did not simply hollow out the granite. They created carefully proportioned chambers, straight walls, curved ceilings, and remarkably smooth interior surfaces. The stone was polished to an almost mirror-like finish. One of the most famous examples is the Lomas Rishi cave. Its entrance is unlike anything else in the complex. The doorway is carved to resemble the entrance of a wooden or thatched structure, complete with an arched facade and decorative details. Stone has been made to imitate an earlier architectural tradition built from perishable materials. Inside, the contrast is striking. The entrance appears highly decorative, but the chamber beyond is simple and geometric. A narrow passage opens into a larger interior space, with walls polished across the granite. The polishing is particularly remarkable. Granite is an extremely hard material. Creating such smooth surfaces would have required enormous effort, using tools capable of gradually removing and refining the stone. The builders were working inside the mountain, yet they achieved surfaces that still appear carefully finished today. The Sudama cave provides another important example. Its interior contains a circular chamber connected to a rectangular hall. The geometry is extremely clean, with the curved chamber meeting the straight passage in a carefully controlled arrangement. These spaces were not designed as ordinary houses. They were associated with ascetic religious communities, where meditation, retreat, and religious practice could take place away from the settlements outside. The acoustic properties of the chambers are also striking. Sound can travel and reverberate strongly across the polished stone. Whether this was deliberately designed into the architecture, or simply a consequence of the cave's shape and materials, is difficult to establish. Imagine entering one of these caves during the Mauryan period. The outside landscape would be bright and open, but inside, the polished granite would create a completely different environment. A voice could echo through the chamber, while the smooth walls reflected the faint light from lamps. The inscriptions provide one of the most important clues to the cave's history. They tell us that rulers could dedicate these spaces to religious communities, connecting royal authority with ascetic traditions. This suggests that the caves were part of a broader political and religious landscape. But the Barabar Hills contain more than the famous caves alone. Nearby Nagarjuni Hill contains additional rock-cut chambers, some dating to the later Mauryan period. Together, the caves demonstrate that the tradition of carving religious spaces directly into granite continued beyond the reign of Ashoka. The architecture also had a long influence. Later Indian rock-cut architecture would become far more elaborate, with enormous cave monasteries, temples, pillared halls, and sculpted facades. The Barabar caves represent an early stage in that development. Their builders were working with a difficult material, but the results were surprisingly refined. The caves had to be planned before excavation began, because once granite was removed, there was no easy way to put it back. The dimensions, angles, and interior shapes all had to be controlled during construction. That makes the caves valuable evidence of ancient engineering. The finished rooms may look simple, but their simplicity required precision. Every wall, every curve, and every polished surface had to be created directly from the living rock. Eventually, the religious communities associated with the caves disappeared or changed. Later generations continued to visit the hills, but the original context of the chambers became increasingly distant. The polished interiors survived, even as the world around them transformed. Today, the Barabar caves remain among the most important surviving monuments of the Mauryan period. They preserve inscriptions, early examples of Indian rock-cut architecture, and some of the most remarkable polished stone surfaces from ancient India. And perhaps the most interesting feature is that the caves do not look ancient in the way we might expect. There are no enormous statues filling the chambers, no vast temples, no complicated carvings covering every wall. Instead, the achievement lies in the precision of the space itself. The Barabar caves are remarkable because ancient craftsmen carved complete architectural interiors into one of the hardest stones available to them. They created halls, circular chambers, curved ceilings, and polished granite walls more than 2,000 years ago. The people who worked inside these hills left behind no detailed record of how they achieved it, but their finished chambers remain. And inside the Barabar Hills, the smooth granite still preserves the quiet spaces created for ancient ascetics during one of the most important periods in India's early history, the Kaimanawa Wall of New Zealand. Deep within the forests near Lake Taupo, a strange formation appears to rise from the ground like the remains of an ancient stone wall. Large rectangular blocks seem to be stacked in horizontal courses. Their surfaces appear unusually straight, and from certain angles, the formation looks remarkably architectural. This is the Kaimanawa Wall, one of New Zealand's most controversial archaeological-looking formations. But there is an important problem. It probably isn't a wall at all. The formation lies in the Kaimanawa Forest Park on New Zealand's North Island. For years, its regular blocks attracted attention because they seemed almost too geometric to be natural. Some observers argued that the stones were evidence of an ancient structure, possibly constructed by a civilization that existed before the arrival of Polynesian settlers. Those claims became widely discussed during the 1990s, turning the formation into one of New Zealand's best-known archaeological controversies. At first glance, the argument seems understandable. The exposed section contains blocks with relatively flat faces. Horizontal lines appear to divide them, and the overall arrangement can resemble a carefully constructed wall. But archaeology requires more than appearance. The question was whether the stones had actually been placed there by people, or whether geology could produce the same pattern. Investigations by archaeologist Neville Ritchie and geologist Peter Wood provided a very different explanation. The formation was identified as an outcrop of Rangitaiki ignimbrite, a volcanic rock formed roughly 330,000 years ago. The apparent blocks are produced by natural fractures that developed as the hot volcanic material cooled and contracted. This is important because volcanic rocks can fracture in surprisingly regular patterns. As the material cools, internal stresses develop, cracks form, and those cracks can intersect in ways that create angular blocks. What appears to be masonry from a distance can therefore be the result of geological processes operating hundreds of thousands of years before humans arrived in New Zealand. Closer examination provided another clue. The supposed blocks do not actually have the consistency expected from carefully shaped building stones. Their dimensions vary. The joints are not perfectly straight, and many of the surfaces contain small irregularities that match across adjoining pieces of rock. Those matching irregularities are particularly significant. If two surfaces belong to the same original mass of rock, their irregularities can continue naturally from one section into another. That is exactly what investigators found. The formation also does not behave like a conventional wall. The joints are generally not arranged in the staggered pattern normally used when constructing stable masonry. Instead, the fractures continue through the larger geological formation. The apparent courses are therefore part of the natural structure of the rock, rather than separate stones that were transported and stacked. Further investigation strengthened this interpretation. Excavation in front of the formation revealed that the apparent blocks continued downward into the underlying rock. Rather than sitting on a foundation, they were connected to the bedrock itself. The wall was not something constructed on the ground, it was part of the ground. That finding changes the story completely. There was no hidden ancient city, no buried stone structure, and no convincing evidence that people had shaped the formation. Instead, the strange appearance comes from the way volcanic rock naturally fractured and weathered. But the controversy is still useful. The Kaimanawa Wall became an example of how easily natural geology can be mistaken for ancient architecture. The human eye is extremely good at recognizing familiar patterns. When we see repeated rectangular shapes, we naturally think of blocks. When those blocks appear to be arranged in horizontal lines, we think of walls. But nature can produce both. Imagine standing in front of the formation for the first time. Vegetation surrounds the outcrop. The ground rises behind it, and a row of apparently massive stone blocks sits directly in front of you. Without geological context, it would be easy to wonder whether someone had built it. That visual impression is precisely what made the site so controversial. The story also became connected with claims about a supposed pre-Maori civilization in New Zealand. Some theorists suggested that the formation was evidence for an earlier population. However, there is no accepted archaeological evidence supporting the existence of a separate ancient civilization responsible for the Kaimanawa Formation. New Zealand's accepted archaeological history places the first Polynesian settlement in the late 13th century. The Kaimanawa Wall, therefore, should not be presented as an unexplained ancient construction. Its importance lies somewhere else. It demonstrates how archaeology, geology, and careful field investigation can overturn an attractive interpretation. A formation that initially looked like a monumental structure turned out to be an example of ancient volcanic geology. The rock itself is extraordinarily old compared with human settlement in New Zealand. The fractures formed when the ignimbrite cooled, long before any human community could have encountered the landscape. Over hundreds of thousands of years, erosion, gravity, earthquakes, and tree roots could then alter and expose the fractured rock. These processes helped create the appearance seen today. There is something valuable about that conclusion. Ancient mysteries do not always end with an archaeological discovery. Sometimes, they end with geology. And that does not make the site less interesting. In some ways, it makes it more revealing. The Kaimanawa Formation shows how dramatically the landscape can change without human intervention. A volcanic deposit formed hundreds of thousands of years ago. Cooling fractures divided it into angular sections. Natural forces exposed those sections. And eventually, people saw a pattern that looked remarkably familiar. The White Horse of Uffington. Across the chalk hills of Oxfordshire, a huge white figure stretches across the side of a prehistoric landscape. Its body is formed from long sweeping lines. Its legs extend across the hillside, and its head looks toward the valley below. At 111 meters from tail to ear, the figure is far too large to understand properly from the ground. This is the Uffington White Horse, Britain's oldest scientifically dated chalk hill figure. The horse lies on White Horse Hill beside the ancient Ridgeway, a route that crossed the chalk uplands of southern England and was used for movement long before the modern road network existed. Nearby stands Uffington Castle, an Iron Age hill fort occupying the summit of the same ridge. The horse and the hill fort are therefore part of a much larger archaeological landscape. The figure itself is unusual. It does not look like a naturalistic horse. Instead, The body is formed from elegant, abstract curves, with long, narrow legs, a thin tail, and an elongated neck. From a distance, the shape is immediately recognizable, but up close, it becomes difficult to understand exactly how the original builders created it. The horse was made by cutting into the chalk hillside, removing the turf and exposing the pale material beneath. The exposed chalk created a bright image against the surrounding green grass, but keeping that image visible required continuous maintenance. Grass and soil naturally creep back across the exposed surface, gradually reducing the outline. That maintenance continued for centuries. Local communities repeatedly cleaned and recut the figure, preserving its shape as generations passed. Historical records describe regular scouring of the horse, a tradition that continued into the modern period. This creates an unusual archaeological problem. The horse we see today may not look exactly as it did when it was first created. The outline has changed. Some sections have narrowed, and repeated maintenance has altered parts of the figure. Recent archaeological work found that the head and neck had become substantially narrower as soil and vegetation encroached. But the most important question is its age. For many years, researchers debated when the horse was actually created. Some earlier interpretations placed it in the Iron Age, while others suggested later origins. Scientific dating eventually changed that discussion. Samples from the lowest layers of the figure were examined using optically stimulated luminescence, or OSL, a technique that can estimate when mineral grains were last exposed to sunlight. The results indicated an origin in the late Bronze Age or early Iron Age. English Heritage currently describes the figure as potentially dating between about 1380 and 550 BC based on earlier OSL work. That makes the horse considerably older than many people realize. It was already ancient when later Iron Age communities occupied the surrounding landscape. The nearby hill fort was constructed much later, meaning the horse may have existed before the defensive enclosure that now stands beside it. But why create a horse on the hillside? That question remains unanswered. The figure is so large that it was clearly intended to be seen from a considerable distance. Its position on the steep western-facing slope made it visible across the surrounding valley. One possibility is that it functioned as a territorial marker, a huge symbol announcing the presence of a particular community. Another possibility is that the horse had a religious or symbolic role. Horses were important animals in prehistoric Britain, and their appearance in later archaeological material suggests that they could carry considerable social and religious significance. But there is no inscription telling us what this particular horse represented. The surrounding landscape provides additional clues. Uffington Castle sits only about 170 meters from the horse, and prehistoric burial mounds are scattered across the wider hill. The Ridgeway passes nearby, creating a landscape where movement, burial, settlement, and monumental imagery were concentrated in the same area. Imagine approaching the hill thousands of years ago. There would have been no modern roads, no fences, and no houses covering the valley. Instead, a vast chalk figure would have stretched across the hillside, visible from far away. Nearby, the summit would have contained an enclosed hill fort, and beyond it, the ancient ridgeway continued across the chalk landscape. The horse may therefore have worked as part of a much larger visual system. People traveling along the ridge could see the figure. Communities in the surrounding valleys could recognize it, and those living near the hill could maintain it over generations. The maintenance itself is significant. A monument this large does not survive automatically. Without repeated removal of vegetation, the chalk would disappear beneath the grass. The fact that the horse remained visible for centuries suggests that people continued to care about it. That tradition survived dramatic changes in Britain. Political systems changed, religions changed, languages changed, and new communities settled across the landscape. Yet the horse continued to be maintained. By the medieval period, the figure had already become a landmark. Later traditions connected the horse with St. George and the dragon, giving the nearby mound its name, Dragon Hill. But those legends belong to a much later world than the monument itself. The horse therefore accumulated different meanings over time. Its original purpose may have been forgotten, but the physical monument remained important enough for later generations to preserve. That makes Uffington unusual. It is not simply an ancient object that survived untouched. It is a monument that continued to exist because people repeatedly chose to maintain it. Modern archaeology has also revealed that the figure itself was not static. Aerial surveys and earlier records show that the shape has changed over time, and researchers now believe that parts of the original outline may lie beneath later soil and vegetation. The visible horse may therefore represent only one stage in a much longer history. And this raises another question. If the outline changed, how close is the modern horse to what Bronze Age people actually created? Archaeologists are continuing to investigate this through new surveys and dating techniques. The aim is not simply to preserve the horse, but to understand how it evolved. The stone forest of Marcahuasi. High in the Andes of Peru, a vast plateau is covered with strange formations of weathered stone. Some appear to resemble human faces, others look like animals, and several seem almost architectural, as if walls and figures were carved into the mountainside. This is Marcahuasi, a high-altitude landscape in the Andes that has attracted archaeologists, geologists, and visitors for generations. Marcahuasi lies in the mountains east of Lima, at an elevation of roughly 4,000 meters above sea level. The environment is harsh. Cold winds move across the plateau. Vegetation is limited, and the surrounding mountains create a landscape that feels far removed from the cities of the Peruvian coast. Yet scattered across this high plateau are hundreds of unusual rock formations. The rocks are primarily volcanic, and their shapes have been strongly influenced by erosion, wind, rain, temperature changes, and the repeated freezing and thawing of water have gradually altered the exposed stone. Over long periods, natural processes can produce surprisingly complex forms. This is particularly noticeable at Marcahuasi. Some formations have flat surfaces, deep grooves, rounded edges, and vertical faces. From certain angles, they can resemble familiar objects or living creatures, but the resemblance can change completely when viewed from another direction. This has led to a long-running debate about the landscape. Some people have argued that certain formations were deliberately carved by an ancient civilization. Others consider the shapes primarily the result of natural geological processes. The distinction is important because not every unusual-looking rock is an archaeological monument. The geology of Marcahuasi provides a strong reason to take natural formations seriously. The plateau contains volcanic rock that has fractured and weathered over extremely long periods. Natural joints within the stone can create sharp edges, while erosion removes softer sections around them. Eventually, the remaining rock can take on forms that appear remarkably deliberate. Imagine approaching one of the larger formations. From one direction, it may look like a massive head. Move several meters to the side, and the resemblance begins to disappear. The rock becomes an ordinary geological formation again. This changing appearance is one of the most fascinating features of Marcahuasi. The landscape is also sometimes associated with ancient human activity. Small archaeological remains have been reported in the broader region, and the plateau contains evidence of human use. But that does not automatically demonstrate that the largest formations were carved. Distinguishing natural features from modified ones requires archaeological evidence. The high altitude would also have made permanent occupation difficult. Temperatures can fall dramatically, and the growing season is limited. People living in the surrounding Andes adapted to these conditions through seasonal movement, animal herding, and the use of different ecological zones. Marcahuasi therefore existed within a wider Andean landscape. The plateau was not completely disconnected from human activity. People traveled through the mountains, used high-altitude pastures, and interacted with landscapes that could carry religious or cultural significance. The question is whether the unusual formations themselves played a specific role. There is no surviving inscription explaining their purpose. No clear ancient text identifies the rocks. And there is no universally accepted archaeological evidence showing that the most famous formations were deliberately carved. That uncertainty has allowed many interpretations to develop. Some have suggested ceremonial uses, others have proposed astronomical connections, and some have gone much further, describing the formations as evidence of a lost civilization. But those stronger claims remain unsupported by mainstream archaeological evidence. What can be established is more subtle. The landscape itself is unusual. Its geology creates an extraordinary collection of forms, and humans have clearly noticed and interpreted those forms for generations. The meaning of a landscape can exist even when its features were not created by people. This is an important distinction in archaeology. A natural formation can become culturally significant, even if humans did not build it. People can gather around it, give it names, tell stories about it, or incorporated into their understanding of the surrounding world. Imagine standing on the plateau centuries ago. The air would be thin, the landscape almost completely open, and enormous rock formations would rise from the grassland. Without modern geological knowledge, it would not be surprising for people to attach stories or symbolic meanings to unusual stones. But the original beliefs of the communities who may have used this landscape remain difficult to reconstruct. Much of the modern fascination with Markawasi comes from the shapes themselves. While the archaeological evidence is considerably more limited, modern researchers therefore approach the site carefully. Geological explanations can account for many of the formations, while archaeological evidence must be examined separately. The challenge is determining where natural processes end and genuine human modification begins. That question has not been completely resolved for every feature of the plateau. Some formations remain visually striking, and their surfaces deserve detailed study. But extraordinary appearance alone is not enough to establish human construction. The wider importance of Markawasi may therefore lie in the relationship between geology and human perception. Nature created the stone, but people gave the landscape meaning. And over time, those interpretations became part of the identity of the place. Today, visitors continue to travel into the high Andes to see the formations. From a distance, the plateau appears almost empty. Then the rocks begin to emerge, one after another, taking shapes that seem strangely familiar. The ancient fortress of Qasr al-Azraq. In the middle of Jordan's eastern desert, a dark stone fortress rises from an otherwise open landscape. Its walls are built from black basalt. Its towers stand above the surrounding plain, and its massive entrance still carries traces of the many civilizations that used this place. This is Qasr al-Azraq, a desert fortress whose history stretches across many centuries. Qasr al-Azraq stands near the Azraq Oasis, one of the few places in this vast desert where water was naturally available. That location was crucial. For travelers crossing the eastern deserts, an oasis could provide water, shelter, and a place to rest. A fortress built beside it could therefore control one of the most important resources in the region. The earliest major structure at the site is generally associated with the Roman period, although the location itself appears to have been important even earlier. The fortress was constructed largely from locally available dark basalt, giving its walls their distinctive black appearance. The stone was heavy, difficult to work, but extremely durable. The fortress has a roughly square plan, with massive walls enclosing an internal courtyard. 4 large corner towers strengthened the structure, while smaller openings in the walls provided controlled access and observation. The architecture is defensive, but its position tells an equally important story. Azraq was not simply a remote military outpost. It stood beside a major oasis, within a wider network of desert routes connecting Syria, Arabia, and the Levant. Caravans and travelers moving across the region could depend on water from the oasis. Control of that water gave the fortress strategic importance. Inside the fortress, the central courtyard provided space for movement and activity. Rooms were built along the walls, and different areas could have served military, administrative, residential, or storage functions at different times. The structure was repeatedly adapted. That long history is one of the most interesting aspects of Qasr al-Azraq. The fortress was not built once and then forgotten. Different powers occupied and modified the site, each leaving traces within the same basalt walls. During the Roman period, the site formed part of the empire's wider defensive and communication network. Later, it became associated with the Byzantine world and eventually came under Islamic rule. The fortress continued to matter because the oasis remained important. The building we see today therefore represents several historical layers. Some stones belong to earlier phases, others were reused, and later modifications changed the appearance of the original fortress. This makes the structure more than a single monument. It is a record of repeated occupation. The basalt itself created both advantages and difficulties. The dark volcanic stone was abundant locally, but its hardness made shaping large blocks demanding. Builders therefore used roughly squared stones and heavy masonry, creating thick walls capable of surviving the harsh desert environment. Imagine approaching Qasr al-Azraq centuries ago. Across the flat desert, the black fortress would have been clearly visible. Travelers arriving at the oasis would have encountered its walls, while guards could observe movement across the surrounding landscape. The fortress and the water source existed together. Water was the central reason this location mattered. The Azraq Oasis was historically one of the most important wetland areas in eastern Jordan. Its springs and pools created a rare concentration of water within the desert. For people traveling through this environment, that could make the difference between a safe journey and a dangerous one. The fortress, therefore, represents a basic principle of desert settlement: control the route and control the water. A military structure beside an oasis could protect travelers, store supplies, and provide a secure base for controlling the surrounding region. Centuries later, the fortress became associated with another famous period of Jordanian history. During the Arab Revolt in the early 20th century, Qasr al-Azraq was used by forces operating in the region. It later became associated with T. Lawrence, who stayed at the fortress during the revolt. But this was only one brief chapter in a much longer history. Long before the 20th century, Roman soldiers, Byzantine inhabitants, and Islamic rulers had already passed through these walls. The fortress had survived because the oasis continued to matter. Over time, the landscape around the oasis changed. Water levels declined, modern development altered the environment, and the ancient wetlands became much smaller than they once were. The fortress remained, but the landscape that had originally made it strategically important was transformed. Archaeologists and historians can still trace different phases of construction, but many details remain uncertain. We do not always know exactly how individual rooms were used, or how the fortress functioned during every period of its long history. What is clear is the relationship between architecture and environment. The builders did not choose this location randomly. They built beside water, on important desert routes, and within a landscape where a fortified settlement could control movement and resources. The ancient earthworks of the Amazon. Deep within the forests of the Amazon, the landscape is not always as untouched as it appears. Beneath vegetation, buried beneath soil, and sometimes visible only from above, archaeologists have found enormous geometric earthworks shaped by people who lived in the region long before European arrival. These structures include ditches, raised banks, enclosures, roads, and geometric plazas, evidence that parts of the Amazon were once carefully organized landscapes. For a long time, the Amazon was often described as a wilderness where large-scale human settlement was unlikely. That picture has changed dramatically. Archaeological research has shown that indigenous communities modified portions of the rainforest for centuries, creating settlements and monumental landscapes adapted to the environment. Some of the clearest examples come from the southwestern Amazon, especially the Brazilian state of Acre. Here, hundreds of geometric earthworks known as geoglyphs have been identified. From the ground, many are difficult to recognize, but aerial surveys reveal enormous circles, squares, rectangles, and other carefully planned shapes cut into the landscape. The earthworks were created by digging broad trenches, then using the excavated soil to form raised banks. The result was a combination of depression and elevation, a deliberate alteration of the natural terrain. Some enclosures extend for hundreds of meters. Their scale is important. These were not simply household gardens or small defensive ditches. The largest earthworks required substantial labor, meaning that communities had to organize people to excavate soil, transport it, and maintain the structures. But what were they used for? That question is still being investigated. Some appear to have enclosed large open spaces, while others are connected with roads and settlement areas. Archaeologists have proposed ceremonial gatherings, residential organization, defensive functions, and other communal activities. The evidence does not suggest that every earthwork had exactly the same purpose. The geometry itself is striking. Many of the enclosures have remarkably regular shapes, with straight sections and carefully positioned entrances. The builders were not simply following the natural contours of the forest. They were imposing geometric patterns onto the landscape. Imagine approaching one of these sites when it was still actively used. The surrounding forest would have been managed. Open areas would have existed around the earthworks, and people could have gathered inside the large enclosures. From ground level, the full geometry would have been difficult to appreciate. From above, the design becomes obvious. This is one reason the earthworks remained hidden for so long. As vegetation returned, the structures became absorbed into the forest. Trees grew across the old banks, roots disturbed the soil, and the enormous shapes became difficult to recognize from the ground. Modern aerial photography changed that. Once researchers began examining the landscape from above, Geometric patterns appeared across regions of the Amazon that had previously seemed almost empty. The forest was revealing an archaeological landscape beneath its canopy. The discovery also changed how researchers think about Amazonian societies. These communities were not simply moving through an untouched forest. They were actively managing their surroundings. They cleared selected areas, created pathways, constructed earthworks, and organized spaces for different activities. This does not mean that the entire Amazon was once a single densely populated urban environment. The archaeological evidence points toward a much more varied landscape. Some areas contained substantial settlements. Others were used seasonally, and large portions of rainforest remained relatively undisturbed. The important point is that human influence could be extensive without looking like a modern city. People could shape the environment, use fire and agriculture, construct earthworks, and maintain forests, while still living within a landscape dominated by vegetation. Archaeological excavations have also revealed ceramics, charcoal, plant remains, and other evidence associated with these sites. These materials help researchers establish when the earthworks were constructed and how the surrounding communities lived. Some of the geoglyphs appear to have been built many centuries before European colonization. Their construction, therefore, belongs to a long period of indigenous history that was largely invisible in written European records. The roads are particularly interesting. In some regions, raised or cleared pathways connect earthworks and settlements. These routes suggest that the monuments were not isolated features. They formed part of broader networks across the landscape. The combination of roads, enclosures, settlements, and managed vegetation creates a different picture of the ancient Amazon. Instead of seeing the forest as an empty wilderness, archaeologists can now see traces of human planning extending across it. Yet many questions remain. Who built each earthwork? Why were certain geometric shapes preferred? Were the large enclosures primarily ceremonial, or did they serve several purposes? And how did these communities organize the labor required to construct them? The absence of written records makes these questions difficult. The builders left no descriptions of their plans, no explanations of their ceremonies, and no maps showing how the sites were connected. Instead, archaeologists must reconstruct the past from the earth itself. The forest has also become part of the archaeological story. It concealed the earthworks, but it also helped preserve sections of them. Some banks remain visible beneath vegetation, while modern remote sensing can reveal their original outlines. Today, researchers continue mapping these landscapes across Brazil and other parts of Amazonia. Each new discovery adds another piece to the picture, and the picture is becoming increasingly complex. The ancient Amazon was not simply a place where people survived against nature. In many regions, people actively shaped the environments around them, while adapting their settlements to the forests, rivers, and seasonal conditions. The umbrella stones of Kerala. Across the landscape of Kerala, ancient stone monuments appear beside fields, villages, and quiet stretches of countryside. Some are simple burial markers. Others are chambers built beneath the ground. But among the most distinctive are structures that look almost like stone umbrellas standing above the earth. These are the Kuda Kalu, or umbrella stones, a remarkable part of Kerala's megalithic funerary tradition. The monuments belong broadly to the Iron Age and early historic megalithic traditions of southern India. They are found in several parts of Kerala, often associated with burial landscapes containing other unusual stone structures. At first sight, the Kuda Kalu looks surprisingly simple. A broad, mushroom-shaped stone rests above a narrower supporting element, creating the appearance of an umbrella made entirely from rock. But the form is carefully constructed. The upper stone is usually shaped into a broad, curved cap, while the supporting stone beneath it creates the narrow central stem. The monument therefore combines several pieces into a single recognizable structure. The purpose of these monuments appears to have been connected with the dead. They are associated with megalithic funerary landscapes, where communities created permanent structures to mark or contain burials. But the exact meaning of the umbrella form remains uncertain. This is one of the difficulties of studying Kerala's megalithic monuments. The communities that built them left very little written information about their beliefs. Archaeologists, therefore, have to reconstruct their practices through graves, pottery, iron objects, beads, and the monuments themselves. The Kuda Kalu did not exist in isolation. Other megalithic structures found across Kerala include dolmens, menhirs, cists, rock-cut chambers, and laterite burial monuments. Together, They reveal a complex tradition of dealing with the dead. Different communities could use different architectural forms, even within the same broad cultural period. The choice of stone itself was significant. Large slabs had to be selected, transported, and positioned. The upper capstone could be extremely heavy, meaning that its placement required coordinated labor. Unlike a massive temple, the monument did not require thousands of stones. But even a single large capstone could represent a considerable engineering challenge. Workers needed to move it across the landscape, raise it, and position it accurately above the supporting stone. Imagine approaching one of these monuments centuries ago. The surrounding landscape would have been very different from modern Kerala. There would have been settlements, agricultural areas, forests, and pathways connecting different communities. Among them, a distinctive stone umbrella would mark a particular place. Its visibility may have been important. A funerary monument can serve as a permanent landmark, allowing later generations to recognize a burial place. The structure could remain long after the people who created it had disappeared. Archaeological discoveries associated with Kerala's megalithic burials have revealed objects such as iron tools and weapons, ceramic vessels, beads, and other goods. These finds indicate that the communities responsible for the monuments possessed, developed craft traditions, and participated in wider networks of exchange. Iron was particularly important. The period associated with these monuments saw increasing use of iron technology across southern India. Tools and weapons could be produced more efficiently, agricultural practices changed, and communities interacted across larger territories. The funerary monuments therefore belong to a period of major transformation. People were not simply building graves. They were creating lasting places within an increasingly organized social landscape. The umbrella form itself remains one of the most intriguing features. Why create a monument that looks so different from a conventional burial chamber? Was the shape symbolic? Did it represent something about the deceased? Was it connected with beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead? The archaeological evidence does not provide a definitive answer. There is also evidence that megalithic traditions varied considerably across southern India. Similar-looking monuments can have different dates and functions, and structures that appear unrelated may belong to the same broad funerary tradition. This makes simple interpretations difficult. Over time, the communities that created these monuments changed. New political systems developed, religious traditions evolved, and burial practices shifted. The Kudakalu eventually ceased to be constructed, but the stones remained in the landscape. Centuries passed. Vegetation grew around the monuments, agricultural land expanded, and modern settlements developed nearby. Some stones were damaged or moved, while others survived almost intact. Today, the surviving umbrella stones provide a rare glimpse into the funerary practices of prehistoric and early historic Kerala. They are modest compared with some of the enormous monuments elsewhere in the ancient world, but their distinctive form makes them immediately recognizable. And their importance goes beyond appearance. Each monument represents a decision to invest labor in remembering the dead, to transform ordinary stone into a permanent marker, and to place that marker within a landscape shared by the living. The umbrella stones of Kerala are remarkable because their builders created funerary monuments from a surprisingly simple combination of stone elements: a narrow support, a massive curved cap, and a carefully chosen location. We do not know exactly what the umbrella shape meant, or what ceremonies took place around these monuments, but the stones survived long after the communities that created them disappeared. Across the landscape of Kerala, the Kudakalu still stand above the ground, quiet and unmistakable, preserving a small but fascinating part of the ancient megalithic traditions of southern India. The ancient ruins of Kohedo, high in the mountains of southern Eritrea, a vast archaeological landscape stretches across a plateau more than 2,600 meters above sea level. Stone walls, ruined buildings, ancient pathways, and fragments of a settlement once connected to one of the most important trading networks in the Horn of Africa. This is Kohedo, a highland center whose history remains only partly understood. Kohedo occupies a remarkable position between the Wadi Hadas and Wadi Komele, with steep escarpments surrounding much of the plateau. From the higher ground, the surrounding mountains extend toward the horizon, and on a clear day, the Red Sea can reportedly be seen from the plateau. The location was dramatic, but it was also strategically important. The archaeological evidence suggests that Kohedo was already an important settlement before the rise of the Aksumite kingdom. The wider landscape contains remains dating back to around 700 BC, while much of the surviving urban archaeology belongs to the period between the 2nd and 7th centuries AD. During this later period, Cohato became part of a much larger regional world. Its importance was closely connected with trade. Far to the east, on the Red Sea coast, was the ancient port of Adulis. From Adulis, routes traveled inland toward the highlands and eventually toward Axum. Two major routes passed through valleys close to the Cohato Plateau. That placed the settlement near an important corridor between the coast and the interior. Goods could move along these routes, merchants could travel between different communities, and Cohato could benefit from its position between them. The settlement was therefore not an isolated mountain community. It belonged to a wider commercial landscape extending across the Horn of Africa and beyond. This wider network also connected the region with the Roman and Byzantine worlds. Cohato's inhabitants participated in local trading systems, while the broader civilization of the region maintained relationships with powers and markets around the Red Sea. Exactly how much of this trade passed directly through Cohato remains difficult to establish, but its geographical position was clearly advantageous. The archaeology also suggests that the plateau supported more than a single settlement. Numerous ancient sites are scattered across the surrounding landscape, including urban centers, smaller settlements, agricultural areas, and remains associated with rural activity. Together, they suggest a densely interconnected landscape during parts of the first millennium AD. Agriculture was essential. Cohato stands in a highland environment where water and fertile land had to be carefully managed. Communities cultivated the available land, raised cattle, and relied on local resources to support life on the plateau. The ancient settlement was therefore dependent on both trade and production. This combination is particularly important. Trade could bring wealth, but a settlement could not survive on trade alone. Food had to be produced, animals had to be maintained, and the surrounding land had to support the population. Cohato appears to have developed as both a commercial center and an agricultural landscape. The surviving ruins provide only fragments of this ancient society. Walls, foundations, stone structures, and other archaeological remains are spread across a large area. There are no surviving written records explaining exactly how the settlement was governed or how ordinary people lived within it. That creates one of the major mysteries surrounding Cohato. We can see the remains of a complex society, but its social and economic organization is still poorly understood. UNESCO notes that relatively little archaeological research has been conducted at Cohato compared with the much better-known sites of Axum. The comparison with Axum is important. Axum became one of the major powers of ancient northeastern Africa, known for monumental stelae, royal tombs, palaces, and long-distance trade. Cohato belonged to the same broader cultural world, but its story is much less documented. The archaeological landscape, therefore, offers an unusual opportunity. Because the plateau remained relatively isolated after antiquity, many ancient remains survived with comparatively little later development. The abandonment of the ancient settlement around the 9th century AD helped preserve large parts of the archaeological landscape. For centuries afterward, the plateau was used primarily by pastoral communities. The Saho people have traditionally used the region for cattle herding and seasonal agricultural activity. Their relatively light impact on the ancient remains has helped preserve much of the earlier landscape. Imagine Cohato during its period of prosperity. The plateau would have been very different from the quiet landscape visible today. People would have moved between settlements. Farmers would have worked the surrounding land. Animals would have grazed across the highlands. And merchants could have traveled along routes connecting the plateau with the Red Sea. The settlement would have been part of a much larger network. Adulis on the coast, Axum farther inland, and smaller communities scattered throughout the highlands. Goods and information could move between them, creating an interconnected economic system across difficult terrain. The physical landscape would have shaped that movement. Deep valleys, steep escarpments, and narrow routes controlled where people could travel. The same geography that made Cohato defensible and visually commanding also created natural corridors for movement. But the settlement eventually declined. By around the 9th century AD, the ancient urban occupation had largely ended. The reasons are not completely understood. Changes in regional political power, trade networks, economic conditions, or environmental pressures may all have contributed. The evidence does not yet provide one definitive explanation. After the settlement was abandoned, the ruins remained on the plateau. Buildings deteriorated, paths became overgrown, and the landscape slowly returned to a predominantly pastoral environment. The ancient city became part of the mountain itself. Centuries later, travelers began reporting the ruins again. By the 19th century, foreign visitors were describing the unusual archaeological remains scattered across the plateau, but systematic archaeological investigation has remained comparatively limited. That makes Kohoido especially valuable. There is still a great deal to discover. The surviving ruins could reveal more about agriculture, trade, manufacturing, household organization, and the relationship between the ancient settlement and its environment. The beehive tombs of Al Ain. On a rocky hillside in northern Oman, a line of ancient stone tombs rises against the mountains. Their rounded roofs, carefully fitted stones, and compact circular chambers give them an appearance unlike most burial monuments in the ancient Near East. This is Al Ain, one of the best preserved groups of prehistoric beehive tombs in Oman. The tombs stand near the village of Al Ain, within the spectacular mountain landscape of the Hajar Mountains. Behind them, the mountains rise sharply from the surrounding valleys. In front, the land opens toward the plains and routes that connected communities across southeastern Arabia. The location was not chosen randomly. The tombs were built during the 3rd millennium BC, a period when communities across Oman and the wider Arabian Peninsula were developing complex societies, expanding trade networks, and increasingly elaborate funerary traditions. The monuments at Al Ain belong to this broader archaeological world. Their appearance is immediately distinctive. Each tomb is built from carefully arranged stone, with a circular base, tapering walls, and a domed or beehive-like upper section. From a distance, they resemble small stone towers scattered across the mountainside. The construction is deceptively simple. There are no enormous carved statues, no monumental inscriptions, and no massive temple complexes. Instead, the builders used relatively small pieces of stone, stacking them into stable, corbelled structures. Each layer gradually projects inward, until the roof can be closed above the burial chamber. This technique required careful planning. The stones had to be selected, arranged, and balanced so that each course supported the next. The builders were effectively creating a stone dome without modern mortar or engineering equipment. The tombs were also built in clusters. At Al Ain, several monuments stand close together, creating a distinctive line across the landscape. Nearby sites contain additional tombs of similar construction. Together, they reveal that this was not an isolated architectural experiment. It was part of a widespread funerary tradition. The people who built these monuments lived during a period of increasing interaction across the region. Oman was rich in resources such as copper, a material that became extremely important during the Bronze Age. Copper from Oman was traded across the Arabian Gulf, connecting communities with the wider ancient Near East. This wider network is one of the reasons the tombs are so important. The people who built them were not living in complete isolation. They belonged to societies participating in long-distance exchange, moving materials, ideas, and cultural traditions across considerable distances. Archaeological evidence from Oman has connected Bronze Age communities with the ancient trading network known as Magan. Mesopotamian texts refer to Magan as a region associated with copper and other resources, and many researchers identify it broadly with parts of southeastern Arabia. Exactly how political authority operated within Magan remains debated, but the trade connections are well established. The tombs therefore belong to a period when Oman was becoming increasingly connected to distant regions. Yet their architecture remained strongly local. The builders used stone from the surrounding mountains, creating monuments adapted to the local environment. Imagine approaching Al Ain thousands of years ago. The tombs would have stood clearly against the mountain landscape, their pale stone surfaces contrasting with the darker rock around them. People returning to the cemetery would have recognized individual monuments, and the cluster itself may have represented the memory of an entire community. The exact rituals performed inside the tombs remain uncertain. Some Bronze Age tombs in Oman were used for collective burials, with human remains placed inside over extended periods. Objects could also accompany the dead, but the evidence varies between sites, and the precise practices at every individual tomb cannot always be reconstructed. This is an important distinction. We know these structures were funerary monuments, but we cannot confidently reconstruct every belief associated with them. There are no surviving texts explaining what the builders thought happened after death. or why particular tombs received particular forms. The architecture itself may nevertheless tell us something. Building a permanent stone monument required a commitment to a specific place. The tomb could remain visible long after an individual burial, allowing later generations to recognize and return to the same landscape. The location may also have mattered socially. The tombs stand prominently against the mountains, making them visible across the surrounding terrain. They became permanent markers of people and communities within the landscape. Over time, the Bronze Age societies of Oman changed. Trade networks shifted, settlements developed, and new funerary traditions appeared. The beehive tombs eventually ceased to be constructed, but the monuments remained. For thousands of years, they endured the harsh environment of the Hajar Mountains. Strong sunlight, wind, temperature changes, and occasional heavy rainfall gradually weathered the stone. Yet many of the tombs remain remarkably recognizable. Their preservation is one reason Al Ain is so important archaeologically. Together with the nearby sites of Bat and Al Qutm, the tombs form part of a larger Bronze Age cultural landscape recognized for its exceptional archaeological value. The monuments are particularly valuable because they preserve a period when Oman was developing connections far beyond the peninsula. The tombs are local, but the society behind them was part of an international world of Bronze Age exchange. And this creates an interesting contrast. The tombs look isolated, standing quietly among the mountains, but the people who built them were connected to distant communities across the Gulf and beyond. Copper, stone, ceramics, and other materials could travel enormous distances.